The sun had a way of spilling its last gold across the roofs of Dry Creek, as though even the heavens leaned low to watch the town's endless hunger for spectacle. Dust rose in slow clouds, painted orange, drifting between the worn planks of the saloon porch where men leaned back in creaking chairs and women fanned themselves in the heat. It was the hour when shadows stretched long and gossip grew louder than fiddles. I remember that evening clear as yesterday, because that was when Pride walked in on four hooves blacker than midnight, and a boy with little more than bare feet and quiet eyes stood to meet it. Silas McGraw, the richest rancher this side of the Rio, stood with his boots polished like mirrors and a cigar glowing red against the twilight. He was a man who never let a soul forget the weight of his fortune or the size of his herds. And beside him, tethered by thick chain, was a beast the town whispered about in the same breath they spoke of devils, Diablo, his untamable stallion. The horse pawed at the ground, muscles coiled tight as braided rope, nostrils flaring wide, eyes sharp as knives. Folks said 3 men had already broken bones trying to mount him. Silas puffed his smoke and laughed in that cruel way of his. "I'll lay down $1,000, he called to the crowd, "that no man alive can ride this horse for more than a minute." Not one. Gasps rolled through the gathering. $1,000 could build a home, stock a ranch, carry a family through 5 winters. Yet every cowboy in earshot glanced at Diablo and quietly shook his head. That was when I saw Elias Boone, 17, if a day, an orphan boy with dust on his clothes and sorrow stitched to his silence. He carried water buckets for the livery, mucked stalls at dawn, and slept in a loft above the blacksmith's forge. Most days, the town looked through him like he was part of the dust. Tonight they saw him and laughed. "Look there," one man chuckled. "The stable rat's eyes are churnine. Think he wants to try his luck." Elias didn't speak, not then. Just watched Diablo with a look I couldn't name. Maybe it was longing, maybe recognition. His father, they whispered, had once been a horseman of some renown, before whiskey and misfortune laid him low. The boy had inherited nothing but his father's calloused hands and the town's pity. Silas clapped his palm against Diablo's haunch and barked, "Well, we'll take my bet." One ranch hand, broad as a barn door, swaggered forward. He lasted less than 5 heartbeats, thrown skyward, spine cracking against the dirt, hat flying into the crowd. Laughter roared through Dry Creek like a storm. And then came that quiet voice, barely above the hush of dust settling. "I'll try." The world stilled. Heads turned. A ripple of disbelief rolled through the crowd. Elias stood at the edge, hat pressed to his chest, his face pale, but his gaze steady. "You?" A saloon keeper nearly dropped his glass from laughing. "The orphan boy thinks he's a cowboy." Even Silas, proud as a peacock, smirked with cruel amusement. "Well now, let the pup have his turn. I could use the entertainment." They opened the corral gate. Elias stepped inside, each footfall careful, shoulders trembling as if the very air weighed against him. Diablo screamed. "Hi!" Piercing, the sound of fury caged too long. The horse reared, hooves striking sparks from the corral rail. Elias reached out, slow, unarmed, voice whispering something none of us could catch. Diablo lunged. In a blur of muscle and rage, the stallion's hooves crashed inches from the boy's head, the ground quaking beneath. Gasps broke from the crowd. Elias stumbled, dirt smearing his cheek, hat lost in the dust. "Run, boy," someone shouted, "before you're trampled." But Elias did not run. He gathered himself, eyes glassed with unshed tears, and walked out in silence. His back straight, though the laughter behind him tore deeper than any hoof could strike. That night, while the saloon still rang with mockery, I saw him again. Not in the crowd, not among the jeering. He was by the corral, in the silver hush of moonlight. Diablo stood restless, breath steaming in the cold night air. And there was Elias, small as a shadow, a bucket of water at his side. He said nothing, only stood there. Then, after a long silence, he set an apple core by the trough and stepped back. Diablo snorted, suspicious, but did not strike. The nights went on like this. A boy and a beast in quiet company. Elias whispered sometimes, soft and low, words carried on the wind. Old lullabies his father once sang, I later learned. The horse did not answer, but he listened. Little by little, the distance closed. Elias' hand lingered longer on the rail, closer to the stallion's reach. And though Diablo's eyes still burned, there was something else beneath. The same loneliness I'd seen in the boy. Clara Mayfield noticed too. Silas's daughter, with a gaze as sharp as her father's was blind. She often stood in the shadows of her porch, watching Elias' quiet ritual. She never spoke of it, but sometimes when Elias walked through town, she'd let her eyes follow him with a kind of respect no one else dared give. The town, of course, buzzed with ridicule. That boy's wasting his nights, they said. Horse'll kill him soon enough. Gossip spreads like fire in dry grass, and Dry Creek was tinder. But Elias kept on, patient as winter, never forcing, never demanding, just waiting. It was not brute strength he offered Diablo, but something softer, something most men had long forgotten how to give. One evening, I watched as Elias stood within arm's reach. Diablo's head lowered, breath misting inches from his hand. Time slowed. The boy's palm trembled, hovered, then touched the stallion's dark mane. Diablo did not rear, did not strike. He only shuddered, as though remembering what trust once felt like. The boy's eyes shone in that moonlight, wet with something deeper than victory. It was the gaze of someone who had carried loneliness all his days, and finally found another soul who carried it too. And I thought then, sometimes it is the lonely who recognize loneliness best. The weeks slipped by like wind across Canyon Stone, leaving the town restless with talk. Every porch, every poker table, every whispered word in the mercantile circled back to the same thing. The boy and the beast. Elias Boone, the orphan who had no boots to his name, now walked with a quiet fire in his step. Diablo, once thought to be the devil's mount, no longer spat thunder when the boy came near. But Silas McGraw's pride was not a thing to be softened. Pride in a rich man is iron. Bend it, and it only sharpens to spite. At the edge of the saloon one afternoon, cigar smoke curling around his smirk, Silas barked loud enough for all to hear. If the boy thinks he's found his courage, let him prove it before the whole town. At the harvest fair, he'll ride Diablo in front of God and man, or else leave Dry Creek and never show his face again. The words stuck to the air like nails hammered into wood. Folks chuckled, some shook their heads. It wasn't a challenge meant to be won. It was a stage for humiliation. Silas wanted spectacle, not truth. Yet Elias did not flinch. He only nodded once, as though the decision had already been made long before the words left Silas's mouth. Nights deepened. The moon waxed and waned. In those stolen hours, Elias leaned his cheek against the stallion's mane, whispering the language of patience. He learned the rhythm of Diablo's breath, the tilt of his ears, the twitch of his tail before a kick. He did not conquer, he listened, and it was in the listening that the horse slowly gave. Clara Mayfield approached him once, stepping down from her porch with a shawl wrapped tight. She carried no mocking smile, no cruel word. Instead, she held out a strip of cloth. "For your hands," she said quietly, nodding to the raw blisters blooming across his palms. Their eyes met in the stillness. He wanted to thank her, but the words tangled in his throat. So he only took the cloth, tied it round his hand, and bowed his head slightly in gratitude. It was enough. Sometimes the smallest gestures echo the loudest. Then came the day of reckoning. The harvest fair painted Dry Creek with color and noise. Fiddlers sawed their bows across strings. Children ran with candied apples. Banners whipped in the wind. But beneath all the laughter was a hush of anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. At the center of the fairground, Silas strutted like a rooster, Diablo tethered beside him, muscles rippling under the noon sun. The stallion struck the earth with each hoof, dust spiraling like smoke. Townsfolk circled wide, whispering wagers, clinking coins, shaking their heads. When Elias stepped into the arena, the crowd hushed. He wore no spurs, no polished boots, only a plain shirt rolled at the sleeves, Clara's cloth still bound about his hand. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady as the horizon. He moved like a man who carried not just his own weight, but the judgment of every laugh and jeer that had ever cut him. Silas lifted his voice. Here stands our brave fool. Witness, folks, as the boy learns what 1,000 stronger men already know. Diablo cannot be ridden. The corral gates swung wide. Elias walked to the horse, slow as dusk spreading over desert hills. The stallion snorted, pawed the ground, eyes burning. But Elias whispered soft, steady words, the kind not meant for crowds, only for the ears of a creature who had forgotten gentleness. His hand touched the stallion's mane. Diablo trembled, then stilled. The boy pulled himself onto the horse's back. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, explosion. Diablo reared, screaming, hooves striking the sky. The crowd gasped. Dust spun into a storm. The horse bucked, twisted, fury turned loose in flesh and bone. But Elias moved with him, leaning when the stallion lurched, gripping not with iron but with rhythm, his body swaying like he had learned the song of Diablo's rage. The seconds stretched. 5:10:30. The crowd's roar rose and broke. Silas's smirk faltered. Clara clutched her shawl tight, eyes shining with fear and awe. Every buck grew weaker. Every rear came slower. Until at last, Diablo stood still, sides heaving, sweat darkening his hide. The wild stallion lowered his great head, not in defeat, but in something deeper, acceptance. The boy's hand stroked the animal's neck, and Diablo did not flinch. Silence fell over the fairground, heavy as rain before thunder. Then, all at once, applause crashed like a river breaking its banks. Men shouted. Women wept. Children climbed barrels to see the orphan boy who had done what none had dared. Marshal Harlan stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of law and truth. Well, Silas, looks to me like the boy's heart is worth more than your wager. The rancher's face turned stone. Pride soured into fury, but there was no escape from the truth laid bare. With reluctant hands, he drew out the gold, pressed it into Elias's palm, and spat in the dust. But the crowd saw it for what it was, a man beaten not by muscle, but by grace. Clara's eyes lingered on Elias longer than any cheer. A soft smile broke through her awe, as if she had known all along that gentleness was stronger than rage. Elias caught her gaze and lowered his head slightly. Not a declaration, not even a promise, but a recognition. Some bonds are formed without words. As the fair wound down, folks spoke his name with reverence, not ridicule. Elias Boone, the boy who rode Diablo. But I tell you true, it wasn't the gold that changed him, nor the taming of a wild horse. It was something quieter, something that echoed far beyond that dust-filled day. Because Elias had shown a town blinded by pride that dignity can grow in silence, that kindness can stand against cruelty, that even an orphan with nothing can leave behind a mark brighter than wealth. I still remember watching him walk away from the fair, Diablo following, the boy's hand resting gentle on the stallion's mane. The sun dipped low, gilding them both in a light that felt like blessing. And if you're listening close, friend, take this to heart. The fiercest storms of life don't bow to anger or strength alone. Sometimes they yield only to patience, to gentleness, to a steady hand that refuses to strike. Remember this. Worth is not measured in gold or in the eyes of those who mock you. Worth is the quiet courage to meet fury with grace and loneliness with love.